Hey everybody, welcome to RotoCurve Live, presented by Rosters.com. Of course, you can see the promo right below our faces here, all three beautiful faces, that is. You can use a promo code CURVE for an instant $20 bonus on your initial deposit. Now, RC Live, we're back. I know we talked about a little bit basketball last season, but this is football. It's week 2. So for myself, I want to introduce Adam Pfeiffer. You can see to my right, and you can see Jim McCormick, as always, again to my left. So we're going to go over this weekend's slate in NFL DFS. We're going to do it a little bit differently. It's not going to be by position or by game, as I'm sure you're used to seeing. We're going to go through what people really want to know. And what people really want to know, it's simple. We're going to talk about our cash game building blocks, our favorite games to target, and of course, if you've watched any RotoCurve show before, you know we love to talk about our bold calls. So without further ado, let's just get right into it. Cash game building blocks, we'll start with quarterback. Adam, what are you looking at this week?
Yeah, for me, it's kind of simple, honestly. I think Cam Newton is just in with the combination of his floor and upside on any pretty much matchup against San Francisco at home. Whoever made the schedule is pretty rough because Niners on the shortest of weeks have to travel to Carolina. They're 13-point dogs right now, and with Vegas projecting Carolina to score 4 touchdowns in this game, there's no way Cam Newton's not responsible for 3 of them. So I think he's just a safe play as ever, especially because Niners defense was kind of decent at home last year, but they were brutal on the road. So I think Cam pretty much does whatever he wants here. You get the rushing upside, so Cam for me is the building block for a quarterback.
For sure. Jim, what about you? I know Cam is an excellent play because, like Adam just said, he has that matchup, but I want to hear your thoughts on a guy that I think could have another good week.
Yeah, I'm going with Phil Rivers here. Led the league in passing attempts last year. The volume's there. I think the market might be a little bit wary of him in the wake of Keenan Allen's injury. Just kind of seems like kind of an avoid situation. But at the same time, the Jags were 26 in pass defense DVOA on Football Outsiders last year. They added to their secondary, but it's really just a rookie in Ramsey. I don't think the dividends are going to be paid off that early. And honestly, the Jags also are really tough against the run. They added Malik Jackson. They're stout up the middle. They allow, I think, like the fourth or fifth least rushing yards per attempt over the last year, which again, just game script wise, game flow wise, could push the Chargers to pass a ton. And so I think there's value there. So basically, it's also the fifth highest point total. This week's pretty low for point totals. Last night we saw point totals not matter that much with that offensive explosion, but in general, I think those are at least an indicator of volume, of point volume. So, I mean, look, like I said, the leader in pass attempts, the only Drew Brees and him averaged 300 yards last year. The floor is really high here, and we've seen him produce without Keenan Allen before. So I think some kind of unique stack, Danny Woodhead in him or Tyrell Williams in him, is really affordable. And I don't think you need to pay down at quarterback too much. I don't mind Dak this week. I think people will be off him, but there's no reason to save too much money at quarterback. Like that's why I can stomach paying up for Cam as well. I kind of understand what Adam's saying there because there's some affordable plays at running back, which we'll get to.
Absolutely. You heard Jim just mention Phillip Rivers, and Adam, of course, loves Cam Newton. But for me, I'm going to go back to the chalk, guys. You know me. I'm a cash game guy. The ownership percentages usually flows my way, of course, when I'm picking players, and that can be good and can be bad. But for cash games this week, I think it's a little bit too much to look any further than Eli Manning. He's in that top game of the week with the 54 over under right now. We just talked about his ownership percentage, but it's going to be well deserved because he faces the Saints secondary that really struggles, especially now with the loss of their best guy in the secondary in Delvin Breaux. So everyone's going to be talking about Odell Beckham Jr., the guy throwing in the ball. For me, Eli Manning is a good way to go. When I looked at the game last week, Eli Manning threw 3 touchdowns, but he only had 28 passing attempts. That was in a slower game pace last week, of course, against the Cowboys. We're going to see the opposite this week in a fast-paced game against the Saints. And one thing I wanted to touch on here, a little bit of the football nerd coming out in me right now. The Giants are playing a ton of 11 personnel, which basically means 1 running back, 1 tight end, 3 receivers. Last week, OBJ, Victor Cruz, and Sterling Shepard were all on the field for at least 89% of the snaps. That's a lot. That's a lot of 3 receiver sets. when you get all that much space and those three talents out there, it means the quarterback's going to be throwing the ball a lot. So for me, I think the way that this game comes together, all the passing attempts we should expect to see, and the way the personnel matches up against this defense, it doesn't really make any sense to me in cash games at least to go any other direction. And one more quick thing about this. The Giants have gone in and over, and looking at over-unders, 10 of their last 16 games, and the Saints have gone in the same way. So this game, between those two teams, their last 32 combined games, 20 times they've hit the over. So high-scoring game, everything pretty much goes their direction. So we just talked about our quarterbacks. I just mentioned Eli Manning. We know Jim likes Phillip Rivers, and Cam Newton, of course, is Adam's selection. But running backs here, this is where we want to target players. This is where the most important thing happens because of the difference in scoring. So, Adam, right away, your running backs this week. Who's that building block for your cash games?
Yeah, there's actually a couple for me. C.J. Anderson's one. You could go with him, obviously. You could go with David Johnson. But I think it's really risky right now to kind of fade D'Angelo Williams as long as Le'Veon Bell's out. We kind of saw, like, situations where you kind of would be risking fading certain players. Obviously, that was the case last year during Odell Beckham's ridiculous run and his rookie year. And I don't know if I want to fade D'Angelo Williams right now. I mean, played 82% of the snaps in week 1, dominated the Redskins' terrible run defense. Not as good of a matchup, but you know he's going to get all the carries. You know he's going to get targets out of the backfield. He had 6 targets in that game on Monday night. And his numbers without Le'Veon are just basically top 3 running back numbers that really no one seems to be talking about as much. I mean, his last 10 games without Le'Veon Bell in the lineup, he's averaging 19.9 carries for 94 yards, and he scored 13 touchdowns in those 10 games. Just ridiculous numbers. He was top 5 in red zone rushing attempts last season, was a huge touchdown machine. When they got in close, they looked at him, especially because Pittsburgh doesn't have the personnel to throw the ball in the red zone outside of Antonio Brown and maybe Jesse James, who's kind of raw. So D'Angelo Williams against Cincinnati, without Vontaze Burfict, they have been really bad against pass-catching running backs. In the games that he's missed over the last year due to suspension and injury, opposing number 1 backs have averaged just under 5 receptions per game. So I think that's a nice PPR floor for him. These Pittsburgh-Cincinnati games are no longer the defensive battles that they once were. So I think D'Angelo Williams, again, as long as Le'Veon Bell is out, I'm going to have a hard time not putting him in my rosters.
That makes a lot of sense. He's going to be a lot of my rosters as well. But in order to fit an expensive guy like that, you're going to need a cheap guy. Jim, who's that guy you're building around at running back this week?
Well, TJ Yeldon, I think, Scott Barrett of Pro Football Focus has a pretty cool – he's a good follow on Twitter. He's got a pretty cool index that he keeps up with. It's a kind of the bell cow index, in this league of specialization, of splintered backfields, committee backfields, Adam just mentioned one of the rare bell cows in Pittsburgh, a guy who gets, 80%, really 90+% of the workload. Well, we found that with TJ Yeldon. Chris Ivory's missing again this week. That's already been, determined. I mean, man, the guy got out of the hospital just on Tuesday, so he's not ready to play NFL football right now. Yeldon consumed 96% of the PPR points from the backfield last week, and he's discounted on DraftKings significantly. Still 4,700 on rosters. He's also really cheap. It's like the pricing index isn't reflecting the fact that he's the sole guy. It's almost like he's being treated as if he's still in this in a committee. So he's one of only 9 backs right now in the league who's consuming 80+% of the workload, and he's even topping the high 90s. So here's a guy against a soft. To talk about the linebacker situation, like Adam mentioned, matching that kind of stuff. Manti Te'o for the Chargers allowed 7 of 7 targets to be completed last week in the passing game. He's the 3-down linebacker. Denzel Perryman only played 46% of the snaps. So you're talking about a really exploitable matchup in the flats. We didn't see a ton of passing involvement or success, rather, for Yeldon last week, but 25 touches, a game that they're going to, the snaps will be up in this game, you can assume. The Jags play quickly, and they run a lot of plays. So I just think it's a situation where you're going to be able to eat, basically, with Yeldon. And he's the kind of guy, for example, you pair a Yeldon with, say, a Jeremy Langford, you pair a Yeldon with a Woodhead, and you're still going to get 15-plus touches for each player, and then you can pay up for those. You can get shares of Beckham. You can get shares of A.J. Green. So I think it allows you to pay up.
That's an excellent point there. And, yeah, without Ivory, you're looking at a guy like Yeldon who is a bell cow back. We talked about D'Angelo Williams. That's a bell cow back as well. But the guy I'm looking at is another one of these guys. C.J. Anderson for the Denver Broncos this week. This guy was somebody that was really high on a lot of players' radars last year and didn't really seem to turn it on until the end of the season and, of course, in the playoffs. But in week one, Anderson played 83% of the offensive snaps, which is pretty good, but it's not an elite number for running back. The thing is, he had an absurd touch rate of, I believe, it was like 50% or something crazy like that, which is really absurd for a running back, especially in today's league. And the way I wanted to look at this game is last week, 24 touches for 139 yards and 2 touchdowns total. He caught some passes. He ran the ball. That was against the Panthers. This week, he's facing the Colts, who were torched last week. They allowed 21 carries for 109 yards and 2 touchdowns on the ground to running back. But through the air, they were only targeted 10 times running back. They caught all 10 passes, 120 yards, 2 touchdowns. And that was between 2 backs. Both of those guys were elite running back ones in terms of scoring last week, and Theo Riddick and Amir Abdullah. This week, a guy that plays 80% of the snaps is going to be getting all of that work. So for me, I think C.J. Anderson is a must-play right now in cash games because he could be due for a monster game. All those snaps, that big workload, we're looking at something that could be very, very impressive this week.
And dude, they like that game they gave up to the Lions last week. That was against last year's. They were a bottom 3 running offense last year, and they just Abdul looked amazing. They just can't tackle anybody, and they're already without. Vontae Davis has been ruled out. Patrick Robinson's been ruled out. Their defensive tackle Henry Anderson's been ruled out. So Anderson, considering what Denver wants to do, I think he's a lock for at least 80 and a touchdown in this game, and that might even be generous.
I'm with you. I couldn't agree more. I think that the next thing we have to move on to real quick is wide receivers, because at running back, we mentioned these 3 guys that get a lot of work, but at receivers, especially these scoring systems like DraftKings and rosters, you're going to need PPR guys, and being able to do that, you're going to need guys to get a lot of work. So, Adam, let's start with your number 1 receiver this week, because he saw a lot of work last week.
Yeah, I've been talking about him all week. Not like he's sneaky or anything, but with wide receivers so stacked, everybody's going to be on Odell Beckham against the Saints. No kidding. Everybody's going to be on Antonio Brown every week. But A.J. Green might be my number 1 receiver this week. I mean, you talk about target share. He is going to see close to 200 targets this year. It's no doubt. He saw 13 and caught 12 of them in week 1. 43% of the targets in that game. And this is just a great matchup. He has dominated this Pittsburgh secondary as of late. 36 catches, 556 yards, 3 touchdowns over his last 4 games against the Steelers. And wide receiver ones in general have killed the Steelers as of late. The number 1 receiver against the Steelers has gone for either 100 yards or a touchdown in 10 of the last 17 games, that 10th game being Deshaun Jackson on Monday night, who went over 100 yards. Probably could have scored if Kirk Cousins wasn't so god-awful in the red zone. Again, I talked about this game. That's not going to be the defensive battles that we once saw. I think the Bengals struggled to run the football for the 2nd straight week. Pittsburgh's been pretty good against the run since the start of last season. And just targets. A.J. Green is going to see close to 15 targets in this game. And if he sees 15 targets, he's going for 100 and a touchdown against his secondary.
Yeah, that's an excellent pick. I know we talked about on a previous show this week about the wide receivers and what we're going to look at between wide receiver 1 being Odell Beckham or A.J. Green. You made a compelling case for Green. But, Jim, at wide receiver this week, the guy that you're building around could be a touchdown and yard machine this week. We talked about him before coming on. I want to hear your argument for that guy that you're looking at as that building block.
Yeah, it's the human helicopter, Alshon Jeffrey. You know, he gets downfield. He's got an incredible contested catch rate, huge catch radius, all those fun draftnik kind of terms. He accomplishes those. More importantly, since the start of last season, the Eagles have allowed the 6th most receiving yards, the 4th most receptions, the 4th most touchdowns to receivers. And that's not even counting the fact that, you know, they're missing Leotis McKelvin this week more than likely. He's banged up with a hamstring injury. Malcolm Jenkins, the super safety, basically revealed some info to Les Bowen of the Daily News and said that, they're going to see a situation where Jalen Mills, the 7th-round rookie, while he was a training camp darling, getting out there in the real field and guarding Alshon Jeffrey is a different animal. I do think they're going to game to get Alshon those looks. They're going to move Alshon around to get him on Mills, at least for a percentage of his snaps. We saw that last week, for example. They moved Antonio Brown around to get him against Rashad Breeland. Offenses will do that to look for these favorable things. I think Cutler could really pick on Mills, and this could be a big game. despite being limited to 6 targets last week, I know Alshon Jeffrey was kind of quiet in the usage sense. I mean, Adam even mentioned before the show that Kevin White outsnapped him. At the same time, his average depth of target was 23 yards downfield. So when he is getting the look, it's really very valuable. If he catches, half of those, he's turning in 80-some yards, just accounting for some yak. He topped 100 yards last week against a much more competent, Houston defense. I just think, even though that game's a low over-under, I still think any points that are coming from Chicago are probably going to come from him in the air or any kind of grinding that Jeremy Langford does, which kind of sounds weird to say. It sounds like he's at a strip club, but really what we're saying, is Alshon's the guy. White is still raw. The route tree's raw. I think Alshon's the guy that's going to get the work and be the guy who puts you over. Plus his pricing, right? His pricing is moderate. You're paying 1,000 plus below those upper guys. And I think he should be in that tier, especially in these 3 wide receiver formats. Don't hesitate to get him in as that third receiver and pay down at tight end, pay down at running back.
Yeah, you just mentioned those cheap running backs to use, so it would be a good idea to slot Jeffrey in because I know everyone's going to be looking at those top-tier receivers. The guy I'm looking at as building block for cash games this week is in the same game as Jeffrey. It's the guy on the other side, number 81, Jordan Matthews. Guy is just $6,900 on DraftKings this week, which is a lot cheaper, $2,000 cheaper than Antonio Brown. Now, not to compare the two, but $2,000 can really give you a boost in other areas. So for me, I'm looking at a guy that last week saw 14 targets, and he only converted on half of them, 7. That's not a good ratio, but considering he turned those 2 into 114 yards and a touchdown, that's an excellent way for me to look at his value for week 2 in a better matchup against the Bears, who really don't have anybody in the secondary that is capable of covering anyone, let alone a guy like Jordan Matthews, who has a bit of a special ability in the slot. He struggles to separate a little bit on the outside, but in the middle, he's one of these guys that can really get you open, get you some fantasy points, and that's what we're looking for. Last week, Matthews played in 71 of 77 snaps for the Eagles. That's a lot. I don't know if the Eagles are going to have as many snaps on offense again this week, but considering he played over 95% of those snaps, he led the Eagles in target rate. He led the Eagles receivers in touch rate, which was 11%. That's high for a receiver. Running backs, we want it around 40, sometimes 50 if you're looking at a big number, but 11% for a receiver is a very good number. We talked about how the Bears defense struggles for sure. The thing that I'm looking at this week is considering he only caught half of his targets last week, if he catches a little bit more than that in a game that I expect to be closer than it was last week for the Eagles, we're looking at a guy that has potential upside for double-digit catches, and I think his floor is around 7 or 8, which brings you to what he got last week, and that's more than enough for me for cash games. So wrapping up receivers, we just talked about, I like Jordan Matthews. I know Adam is a big fan of A.J. Green. You can't discount that. And Jim, Alshon Jeffrey, we both like guys in that game, so it's going to be a lot of fun. Speaking of games, that's the next session of this, the RC Live. It's something that I think a lot of people don't necessarily talk about but need to, especially in tournaments. Which games are we going to target? Everyone goes through each game and mentions the guys they like, but people try to pick one guy from this game, one guy from this game. If a game is a blowout or if a game has a lot of points like we saw last night, you can really score a lot of fantasy points for your lineup to help out. So games to target. Let's get right into it. Adam, which one are you looking at?
Yeah, the Giants-Saints is going to get a lot of attention, but a sneaky game for me is this Detroit-Tennessee game. Has a 47-point total right now, and I think the thing you want to look at with high totals is trying to make it easier to project where value is going to come from. And I think both these teams are going to struggle to run the ball. Detroit and Tennessee both have pretty good defensive fronts, so I think the passing offenses could be really fun in this game. Stafford on the Detroit side, Mariota on the other side. Both teams have some good weapons. I like Mariota's in terms of his running and his throwing, so I like that. And there's some exploitable secondary pieces on both sides. I know Darius Slay is very good for Detroit, but other than that, they're really missing a lot of good players on the secondary. DeAndre Levy, their linebacker, is questionable at best. So I think both these passing offenses could be really, really sneaky in this week 2 slate that everybody's going to be on some of these other games a little bit more.
Jim, what about you? What game are you targeting for this week?
I'm targeting. I've been talking it up. I'm targeting this game in San Diego. We have 2 relatively exploitable secondaries here, which is always a nice matchup. Both of these quarterbacks could drop back 40 times. There's also just a lot of affordable ways to get into this game. Like we said, Yeldon. I'm not an incredible fan of Allen Robinson with the Jason Verrett factor. I know Macklin still got, made value last week, but there is some talk about Robinson really beats up on like the middle and lower tiers. I mean, still there's volume for Robinson. I just think, maybe go to Alshon in that same tier. But really the point is Woodhead, Tyrell Williams, Rivers. I could even see Bortles if you want to be contrarian. So there's ways to get into that game. And, going back to the Vegas trend that Adam's talking about, it's a 47.5 point over-under. It's an East Coast team basically playing at 10 a.m. their time, with Jacksonville. So I just think there's going to be some room for points here. I wouldn't be surprised if San Diego starts off pretty warm. And it's really just, it's an offense. It's a game where you could easily see it going well over. And look, let's chase shootouts, especially with the chalk shootout in New York. Maybe we can get some shares of this on cheaper angles, like Tyrell Williams and Woodhead and Yeldon. You can get all three of those guys and then pay up for your AJ Green, pay up for your Manning, pay up for your Beckham.
Yeah, I'm with you. I think that's the game I'm going to have to talk about. I know that we talked about some two other games that are a little lesser owned games, but for me, I'm all about the chalk, fortunately and unfortunately. But this week, that game, the New Orleans Saints at the New York Giants, the over-under is now 54 points, which is massive. That's over 7 touchdowns, the highest this week. But that's only half the story. Last year, the Saints and the Giants were 31-32 in DVP, which is defense versus position for those newer players that are starting to research this week. That indicates they allow a ton of points against opposing teams. They were 31-32 last year against quarterbacks. They were 30-25 against running backs. And this year, we're already starting to see a pattern, especially with the Saints, who got torched on offense last week through the air, although they only allowed 1 touchdown, of course, on the ground with Jalen Richard rushing for about an 80-yard touchdown. The next thing I'm looking at is the talent perspective in this game. We know about the quarterbacks. We know about Eli. We know about Drew Brees. But how about the receivers? Odell Beckham, Victor Cruz, Sterling Shepard. And, of course, we know about Cooks and Snead after their big weeks last week. So, for me, this is the game that I'm definitely looking at targeting because, once again, I talked about the 11 personnel with the Giants earlier, 90% of the snaps. The Saints do the same thing. All 3 of their receivers played over 75% of the snaps as well. So, we're looking at 2 teams that are going to be passing a lot. They have the personnel to do so. And there's defenses don't have the personnel to stop them. So, I'm definitely going to be looking at this game of the 3 we just mentioned, which, of course, Jim talked about Jacksonville and the San Diego Chargers, and Adam likes the Titans and the Lions game. So those are 3 games you should want to target, and I highly recommend looking at them and picking some players from each game and trying to stack them up in some tournaments. The last part here is, I think, the most fun that we all like to have. And, Jim, I'm going to start you off because I know we did it RotoCurve Live for NBA. Bold calls. Everybody loves them. What's yours?
Bold call is Joseph Flacco, the elite one. He's going to end up in the top 5 at quarterback this week. I just think beating up on this Browns team is going to be a theme throughout the season. As a Sixers fan, I'm sure you can appreciate this reference, but the Browns are the Sixers of the NFL this year. They are tanking, and they really, when a guy from Malvern Prep, Carl Nassib, is your best pass rusher, no offense to Malvern Prep and their alumni, but that's he's basically – there's no intent to get to the quarterback. Ray Horton only sent 8 blitzes last week. That was 21st in the league. He's usually known for blitzing. I think he did that because he knows he can't afford to leverage those extra rushers because they're going to get gashed really badly if he does that. I know that the Ravens don't have the sexiest crew of receivers there. Steve Smith is kind of limping into the end here. At the same time, I think Mike Wallace catches a deep touchdown again. I know we're chasing last week's performance, but hey, we saw how easy it was for the Eagles to get deep on these guys. You got Jamar Taylor, Traymon Williams. That's kind of where cornerbacks go to be at the bottom of Pro Football Focus's rankings. It's Cleveland. So that's a game where I just think you could get him really cheap. He's not incredibly cheap. He's right around the Rivers frame. But contrarian-wise, I think it's a good way to get, a Baltimore stack, which you don't hear that much. That's something that I would consider. Last year, Flacco was on pace for 661 passes. That would tie for the league lead. This Trestman offense passes. I don't think it's a blip. I think that's really what they're going to do. So even with the big lead, I think Baltimore is kind of an interesting sneaky stack.
I'm with you there, absolutely. Flacco last year, like you mentioned, was on pace for 661 passing attempts, averaged over 40 a game. So that's a good way to look at it. I like that bold call. Adam, What about you? I know you have some strong thoughts on a particular game. What about that quarterback?
Yeah, real quick, Jim. All you had to say was Nelson Aguilar scored on Joe Hayden.
Yeah,
That's
right.
all you had to say.
It's true.
But yeah, I talked about the Tennessee Detroit game. I'm on Mariota. I have been all year, 2 weeks, all off season. I just think he has such high upside if Tennessee lets him do what he's capable of doing. That's run the football. They started to do that last year with Malarkey under center. In 10 games with Malarkey as the coach, he had 24 carries. He only had 7 under Wisenhunt. So now they're seeing that Mariota is obviously a freak athlete. He can run the football. 4 carries in week 1. I believe 2 of them were designed. So in this game, again, I don't think the running backs are going to be able to do much from either side. Detroit's secondary was just destroyed by, granted, Andrew Luck is a lot better passing offense for fantasy, but Mariota, I think, with Delaney Walker, I already like Delaney Walker, Mariota pair. DeAndre Levy might not play. Detroit allowed the Colts to go 4 for 4 in the red zone last week. 47-point total. I talked about it. I like it. I love the price on DraftKings. I think Marcus Mariota finishes as a top 7 quarterback in week 1 or week 2. Let's try this week.
I like that. I like that a lot. My bold call, real quick, is going to be a little bit interesting, and it might cause a little bit of a stir here. Travaris Cadet will score more DraftKings PPR points than Danny Woodhead this week. Don't hit me, please. Don't hit me. There is some merit to this. It's not just one of these things I'm throwing out there. Mark Ingram last week only played 42% of the snaps. Cadet had 38% of the snaps. It's only a 1 or 2 snap difference. So the way I'm looking at this game is the same way as the Saints last week. They passed a lot. So I do think Cadet's going to be on the field quite often. For just $3,000, the price minimum on DraftKings, I think he has a chance to really exceed that 4 or 5 times value, which basically means at 3,000, 4 times value would be 12 fantasy points, which is what you're looking for, maybe a little bit more in tournaments because of his price. But a guy that can really exceed value in that way, I'm all aboard. For just 3,000, I'm willing to take the risk. That wraps up RotoCurve Live, RC Live. That's our first show here, week 2. Be sure to tune in each and every Friday throughout the football season. As I will be back with these 2 beautiful men, and Adam Pfeiffer and Jim McCormick. It's going to be a lot of fun this year. Also, football's in 2 days. That big slate starts. Be sure to head over to RotoCurve. We have a ton of tools. All this free content's up. We have an optimizer for your lineups to look at based on the tools. A members-only free roll this week. Be sure to get into that, especially all of you that are members already. Adam has all of his favorites up. He just posted one of my favorite articles to read each week where he details the chalk and talks about some pivots to go away from. I have an article out discussing, of course, the facts that not a lot of people do know about. So this has been RC Live, presented by Rosters.com. As you see below us, use that promo code, get those $20 extra on your initial deposit. For Jim McCormick, there you go, look at that. Jim McCormick, Adam Pfeiffer, I'm Josh Kalachi. Good week 2. Good luck. Jesus, I can't spit it out. Somebody help me. Good luck, everyone.
Take care, guys.